Okay, so I think I will start. It's 5:05 on my phone clock. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those who are joining from different parts of the world. Thank you for joining us in this third session of the virtual discussion series titled Housing Uncertainties, Financial Crisis, and Social Protections. That is organized by the Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut, Habitat for Humanity through the Lebanon National Programme and the MENA Urban Housing Practitioners Hub, and the Norwegian Refugee Council and the United Nations Human Settlements Programme, UNHabitat Lebanon Country Programme. My name is Nanor Karageozian, and it's a great pleasure to be chairing today's session. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be part of it. A brief background about myself, since there is no one to introduce me. I'm the head of the Urban Analysis and Policy Unit at UNHabitat Lebanon, based in Beirut. In our unit, we work on multiple urban research projects and policy projects, including those related to housing, as well as other fields like transport. And I come from a social sciences background with a focus on refugee, migration, and diaspora studies, especially the case of the Armenian diaspora. I was the director of the Armenian Studies program at Haigazian University before joining UNHabitat almost 5 years ago. Before we start, let me just say that unfortunately, I might have to leave a bit early in case we don't finish a bit early due to an unexpected conflict with a family commitment, and apologies in advance for that. If we don't finish by around 6:15, unfortunately, I will have to leave, but Soha or Mona will take over the chairing of the discussion. So as you know, this virtual discussion series seeks to explore comparatively by looking at different country cases like Lebanon, Egypt, Argentina, questions at the intersection of housing uncertainties and financial crises, and to probe the possibilities afforded by social protection schemes to respond to the increasingly dire living conditions of today's urban majorities. So in the first panel discussion, for those who attended, or for those at least who received the invitation but were not able to attend, we set the tone. We discussed the contours of housing financialization in the Arab Middle East. Last week, last Tuesday, the second panel discussion focused on housing loans and mortgage lives. In today's panel discussion, we will focus on urban precarious shelters. So the focus will be on how disenfranchised social groups find shelter in unusual and uninhabitable, non-residential and or dilapidated urban structures in increasingly financialized cities. So our focus is on the landscape of affordable accommodations where these groups secure shelter, often in temporary, conditional, as I said, dilapidated spatial conditions, where they often dwell with the continuous pressure of possible eviction. And in many ways, these accommodations, these temporary accommodations, are residual urban areas, and in our definition, we view them often as an afterthought, because, for example, they've been residual products of failed planning projects or appropriated areas otherwise earmarked for non-residential functions like churches or mosques. They're also in-between place or in-between or transitional structures awaiting redevelopment. Potentially the urban ruins of earlier cycles of boom, where opportunities for temporary extractive rent have arisen. So in this panel, we will have, we initially had 3 speakers, 3 presentations. Unfortunately, one of them, Dr. Marwa Ghazali, had to cancel, and she apologizes for that because she's in the field and she has unfortunately no access, it seems. She has technical difficulties accessing the internet. So I'll be joined by 2 other women presenters that I will have the honor to present shortly. we will focus, they're joining us from Canada and the States, and some of the topics that they will present and we hopefully will discuss will be on the different forms that these kinds of precarious shelter that I mentioned has taken in financialized context. We will see the strategies that we will talk about the strategies deployed by disenfranchised social groups to stay in place or improve their conditions in this situation. We will talk about how crises, financial crises or other types of crime, mostly financial ones, accentuate the situation and intersect with the ability of these residents to hold on to place. Does the financial crisis constitute an accentuation or a lull? And are there any forms of public protections that should be introduced? And what conclusions can be drawn for advocates of the right to housing? So these are some of the topics that we'll see how, if we will cover them all or at least part of them, but this is the focus of today's session. So let me start by introducing our first presenter. It's a great honor for me to present Leilani Farha. She's the Global Director of the SHIFT, an international movement to secure the right to housing. And she's the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing from 2014 till 2020. Her work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good, not a commodity. She has helped develop global human rights standards on the right to housing, including through her typical reports on on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, right-based housing strategies, and the first UN guidelines for the implementation of the right to housing. She is the central character in the award-winning documentary Push regarding the financialization of housing, directed by the Swedish filmmaker Fredrik Gertten. And Leilani and Fredrik now co-host a podcast, Pushback Talks, about finance, housing, and human rights. She will present, the title of her presentation is Implementing the Right to Housing in an Age of Insecurity. Leilani, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Nanor, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers. My heart, as many of you know, is in Lebanon and in Beirut. I am Lebanese, though I was born in Canada and I live in Canada now. But eventually I'll make it back to Beirut and Lebanon at some point. I called my presentation Implementing the Right to Housing in an Age of Insecurity. And I probably could have called it in an age of manufactured insecurity. And we'll get into why I say that at the outset. And I think my comments will probably bridge the previous webinars that happened with today's, because I'm sort of covering a whole range of things. So hopefully we'll see lots of connections and draw lots of threads. I think it's obvious, and there's little doubt, that we are living in an age of housing insecurity. Ask yourself, or help me find a city or a place where wages are keeping a pace with the cost of housing, or where social and deeply affordable housing is privileged through laws and policies over luxury housing or tourist housing. Find me a place where homelessness or informality without basic services isn't prominent. Find me a place where those living in the worst housing conditions aren't more vulnerable to climate change related disasters and events. This is the reality for 1.8 billion people at least. Unaffordable housing, homelessness, informality, susceptibility to climate-related disasters and events. And of course, these are manufactured realities. They're manufactured, in my opinion, by a global order, a global governance, a global economic system that plays itself out at local and international levels in the very same way. There's an identical pattern at the international level and at the local level, and it goes something like this. Those with the least resources, those who own nothing, those who contribute the least to climate change, suffer the most across the board. So you can look at that from a country perspective, and you can look at that from an individual family household perspective within a country. I think this manufactured precarity in the housing sector is directly related to the financialization of housing, or how housing is used as a financial instrument in economy after economy after economy, where housing is used for economic growth of a nation at the expense of its social well-being. In particular, I think housing precarity is deeply tied to what we are told is in fact going to create security. So we live in upside down world. Governments tell us that mortgage-based housing systems where people can own their own home is going to create more security for families and households, and that this is a good thing because when you own your own home, you have security of tenure, for example, and intergenerational security of tenure because you could pass that on to the next generation. And this mortgage-based housing system has been imported to every society, from the least developed countries to, of course, the most developed countries. And I mean, I've seen it in contexts where it hardly makes sense. I went to these teeny island nations off the west coast of Africa, Cape Verde. Teeny island nation, one of the least developed countries in the world. They were starting to impose, when I was there in 2015, starting to impose a mortgage-based housing system. I saw it in Chile, and I saw it in Egypt, which I'm sure you've talked about in your previous webinars. And it just simply doesn't work for the poorest people. That's obvious because the poorest people don't have the down payments required and the capacity to make monthly mortgage payments. But it doesn't even work. Well, and I should say, of course, it absolutely doesn't work in economies that we might call inflationary economies. Now, we might say at this point, every economy is an inflationary economy right now, but some are worse than others. We know Argentina is a very good example, and Lebanon is another very good example. When you're having such fluctuations, mortgage-based housing systems really don't work at the household level. Even in countries like my own, lower income and middle class people who have mortgages are suffering in an inflationary period where interest rates are rising and where their mortgages are tied to rising interest rates, where you have a variable mortgage tied to interest rates. We saw how mortgage-based housing systems can be abused. The global financial crisis, that's what it was about. Predatory lending to low-income, Black, brown, racialized, otherwise disadvantaged households, predatory lending, which then led to the collapse of an economic system. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, you would have thought the global financial crisis would have led to reform and a correction. In fact, what it led to was further and deepening financialization and a kind of new form of financialization, a more intense or uber financialization, where we've seen institutional investors entering the arena in many jurisdictions in both the global north and the global south, and increasingly dominating the housing sector. And with those financial actors, and I'm talking about private equity firms, asset management firms, pension funds, who we always think of as, sort of benign actors, not at all. They have absolutely invaded the housing space. And I say in the global south as well as the global north, as we push toward the sustainable development goals and the requirement that every society have adequate, affordable, secure housing for all by 2030. So I'm seeing Southern nations pivoting to external investors, non-governmental, non-public funds, private investment to try to shore up their housing stock. And the business practices of these actors create precarity. We know this. So we have a mortgage-based housing system that creates precarity, and now we have uber financialization that's creating precarity. And that's because their business model is one that is based on shareholder, or because they put their properties on the stock markets, or they have they say a fiduciary duty to their investors. So if it's a private equity firm, they're managing the funds of a pension fund, for example. They're managing the money of individuals of ultra high net worth, of sovereign wealth funds, et cetera. And they say they have a fiduciary duty to their investor clients. And as a result, they use housing to procure the return on investment. And the way they do that is by ensuring rental accommodation is super expensive, by ensuring the any loans that they themselves offer have very high interest rates. They create hostile housing environments, trying to move tenants out so that they can increase rents, for example. That's a phenomenon in Western Europe and in North America. And by raising rents and by often creating hostile environments so that tenants leave, they do that through renovations, for example, so that they can raise rents when tenants leave. They create all sorts of precarity, financial precarity, and social precarity. And then if we take a step back, what financialization does, and there's other, I should say there are other forms of financialization. I include in the definition of financialization, for example, tourist housing, that is short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and Vrbo, because they are pushing investors to come into the housing market to purchase buildings and turn them into tourist buildings, basically short-term rentals. All of this is leading to a build environment, create more assets that are available to investors. That then contributes immensely to climate change, something that's probably not talked about enough. The built environment represents about 39% of CO2 emissions. That's a huge percentage. And we were always thinking about fossil fuels and climate change, but the built environment is very much part of climate change and CO2 emissions. It is also where so much energy is being used, right? Air conditioners, heaters that are necessary for human well-being. But the build environment that investors really push with governments is contributing to climate change. And with climate change, we know that creates more precarity because there are people living in already precarious housing, living in homelessness, in informality, and in poor housing conditions, and they are most susceptible to climate change. And so there we have the full circle as I see it. And then the privileging of housing as an asset class also creates a further ripple effect of precarity. Because if you privilege luxury housing or investor-driven housing, what governments tend to do at the same time is they weaken tenant protections, right? To enable this turnover of tenants and the raising of rents. That's very advantageous for investors in housing. Weak tenant protections benefit investors. And so weak tenant protections create greater precarity, right? They allow for easy evictions, for example, no fault evictions, evictions at the end of a lease, Weak tenant protections allow for the raising of rents, at the end of a lease or even in the middle of a lease or upon the sale of an apartment or a condominium or a house. We also see that the privileging of housing as an asset class result in a brutal approach to the responses to failed housing systems. By that, I mean what is really, in fact, the topic for today. So what are the responses to a failed housing system? The responses are living in informality, occupying buildings and lands, living in homeless encampments. We see that phenomenon in North America, right? I say those are responses to a failed housing system. People have to live somewhere, and people will live somewhere. They will occupy lands and buildings, in fact, as a rights claim. They're claiming their human right to housing. They're claiming their human right to life by living in abandoned buildings, abandoned lands, public lands, and creating their own housing system. But the response to informality and homelessness is generally quite brutal by most governments, by local level governments as well as national level governments. And that's because housing and land are viewed as assets, as places for wealthy investors to extract more wealth, and they are not viewed as public goods. Housing is not viewed as a public good, as something that is a human right. So where does the right to housing fit into all of this? And I would like to say that it is, in fact, maybe we could call it the antidote to housing as viewed as a commodity or as an asset. Security of tenure is the cornerstone of the human right to housing. That's in law, along with affordability. And affordability is defined based on household income, not what markets can command, and habitability. Those are the three, big pillars in the human right to housing under international human rights law. So I'll say them again: security of tenure, affordability based on household income, and habitability. And so under a human rights-based approach to housing, if governments were to genuinely adopt it, they would put people first, and they would build housing systems that ensure security of tenure, affordability, and habitability. It would demand, in my opinion, and I'm hoping we'll have a discussion about this, the regularization of informal settlements. I actually see that is the only climate-friendly way forward to meeting the SDG goal of secure, affordable, adequate housing for all by 2030, is the regularization of informal settlements and their upgrading, and upgrading without evictions, and upgrading without creating mortgage-based housing systems within informal settlements, which is a real risk. And I think we're seeing that already in some areas. A rights-based housing system would demand accountability from financial actors. So rather than governments rolling out the red carpet to financial actors, which they do through a whole set of tax laws and policies, which we can talk about as well, governments would have to demand human rights outcomes if private financial dollars are moving into the area of housing. So for every public dollar spent to lure in these actors, there would have to be public human rights-based outcomes, public good, public value. And that's something we are not seeing at all. It is amazing when you start looking at the laws and policies that entice these actors in. Real estate investment trusts are one of these financial vehicles used by investors in housing. They're just a trust, and it's a housing-based trust. They don't pay any income tax. And that's a global order. There are about 43 countries that have real estate investment trusts that are active in residential real estate. And in all those 43 jurisdictions, they do not pay income tax, no corporate tax, no income tax. That's one example. That's a public money giveaway, right? Taxes are how we fund things like public housing and social housing. If you look at the land deals, no property taxes required for so many investors who are building housing. There are so many public giveaways for scant public value. That would change under a human rights-based approach. The other thing I'll say is that a human rights-based approach would, of course, require much stronger legal protections for all dwellers, whether you're living in informality, whether you're living in homelessness, or whether you're a tenant. That would be necessary. And as would a whole of government approach. So it would mean that ministries of finance are speaking with ministries responsible for housing, ministries responsible for immigration, refugees, etc. In the current state of affairs, those actors are not speaking to each other. So you have national, regional banks setting policies, not speaking to the different other arms of government. You have ministries of housing not speaking to finance, etc. So I think I'll leave my comments there, and I'll just say finally that I just want to underscore the importance of ensuring that any public dollars that are put toward housing should produce human rights outcomes and public value. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Leilani Farha, for your intervention and a very inspiring presentation. Let's move on to the next presentation, and then we'll, of course, have the chance to have the discussion towards the end. So our next speaker is Solange Munoz. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Her research interests focus on political, economic, and socio-spatial processes of marginalization and contestation in Latin America and the United States. Employing qualitative and ethnographic methods, her research addresses social dimensions of urban development by examining how struggles for access to housing and to remain in the city are routinely lived and experienced by poor and minority urban populations. The title of her presentation today is Informality, the Solution to the Housing Crisis? Solange, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Nanor. Let me share my screen really quick. Okay,
yes,
so can you hear me
it.
Okay? Okay, and you
yes.
can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, today I'll be talking, my question, this is a question I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I recently wrote a paper with a colleague from Argentina and also a couple of colleagues from Germany, really trying to think about what does informality give us, particularly from a perspective of working now in the global north, which I'll explain a little bit in a minute. But also these different opportunities that we have to think about solutions. And, thinking about what Leilani was talking about, and I think it's also very relevant. And then also I use push in a lot of my classes. So I see her at least once a year at some point, because we're talking about it. And I also, and I think push is really important, but I think it also really highlights the fact that we don't have a lot of solutions, because we're not really, nobody is really addressing the issue of housing as a right. And so it brings up what should be happening and yet what is happening. And I think I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer, though I'm totally Debbie Downer, the dire future we might have ahead of us in terms of housing. So yeah, so I'll be talking about this. So specifically, this presentation is kind of like a response, or it's a question, or it's a reaction to the reality of this ongoing and intensifying housing crisis, which is, to be clear, a global housing crisis, as also Leilani pointed out very clearly, and one that I strongly believe cannot be resolved through practices and policies that are grounded in the same neoliberal capitalist market systems that have caused many of the challenges we now see today, but that at the same time, the solutions that I'm always hearing about happen to be placed within this kind of market logic. And as we've discussed in these previous sessions, in the past two previous sessions, within this neoliberal market logic, housing is an asset and not a right. Similarly, in this context, and what has also already been previously discussed, the role of the current state is one that promotes the financialization and marketization of housing as an asset and an investment, often for a global elite and not as a right to shelter for its citizens and their well-being. So as a result, housing and home are now representative of increasingly widespread precarity, again, repeating a lot of what Leilani has already discussed, and instability for many urban and rural inhabitants, many who are not simply the poor or marginalized, but rather part of even a middle class and even other traditionally privileged classes and groups. In this context, it is in this context that I argue that we cannot rely on the market, or in other words, housing policies and programs that rely on and employ market logic to provide affordable housing solution and other fixes. It cannot and will not resolve what is a severe and growing housing crisis, as more and more people are evicted, displaced, or live in ever worsening housing conditions and overall precarity that characterize their entire lives. So this question, is informality a solution to the housing crisis, comes from my own experience, my own expertise and experience living and doing research on housing, evictions, and access in Latin America and also in the United States. My past research focused on informal housing in Dominican Republic and also on Buenos Aires, Argentina. Since COVID-19 made it impossible to travel, I have focused on social housing redevelopment and displacement in the United States since 2020. So I'm kind of doing a comparison here. These countries and regions, the US, which represents the so-called global North, and Latin American countries, which represent the so-called global South, are rarely studied for their similarities. And in fact, in most cases, the language used to describe the social processes in each of these regions is normally quite different. Nevertheless, I argue that the US and Latin American countries have much in common, beginning with their origins as settler colonial regions that included the death, servitude, slavery, and exploitation of those individuals and bodies deemed inferior to white Europeans. But these origins have also led to lasting inequality in governments that have unevenly governed a class-based or racial elite at the expense of other poor and racialized citizens. Although the US is often portrayed quite differently, I argue that it is increasingly becoming and looking more like Latin American countries, particularly in the context of uneven governance, infrastructure, and inequality. So in many ways, I agree, and I use this quote by the sociologist Javier Aullero, who is an urbanist from Argentina, but works at the University of Texas. And he wrote this paper a long time ago, really just kind of promoting this idea that we need to look beyond these kind of global North, global South divisions to understand these processes. And he says the causes and experiences of destitution in the developed North and what he claims are the always developing South are indeed quite varied. And yet years of field research at the urban margins have convinced me that sustained and serious engagement between researchers of urban poverty and or marginality throughout the Americas can lead to better understandings and explanations of the diverse ways in which neoliberal states and economies bolster social and economic vulnerabilities. So I use this as a way to think about solutions to the housing crisis that do not include these market structures, but rather that intentionally or unintentionally challenge or offer possibilities that allow us to look beyond the current conditions set up by financialization, the neoliberal state, and the market system that privileges investment over people's welfare and their right to a particular quality of life. So let me see. I think I think I skipped over something. So yeah. Let's see. So at the same time, I think there are some differences that are of particular importance when thinking about housing and the global housing crisis and its effects on local communities, spaces, and inhabitants. So on some levels, I do see that there are a lot of similarities between the United States in particular. I don't really include Canada here because I don't know it well. And I think because of it is a social welfare system that I think does provide some more protections. But we can talk about that, Leilani. But thinking a lot about the US and particularly the way the US is portrayed versus the way, versus Latin American countries and where I see similarities. However, I do think there are some differences. And again, I hope to be able to discuss all of these things because I don't know if I'm actually right in what I'm saying here. But to put simply, one, I think the role of the state in the United States is both extremely uneven and yet much more visible and present in the lives of its citizens compared to Latin American countries, particularly in marginalized communities, and particularly through surveillance and control, not necessarily in positive ways, but through this idea of surveillance and control. At the same time, I would argue that private property is a much more enforced and prioritized right in the US than in Latin America, with most, if not all, land being labeled and designated to a private or public actor power, which really doesn't allow for informality in the ways that we see it in Latin American countries. And then finally, the uneven nature of access to infrastructure has historically been less extreme in the US, at least during, I think, a period in the 20th century, though I would argue that that is now changing. So given some of these similarities and differences, and what I have seen as possibilities and opportunities for housing that are simply not as available in the US or in the global North context, I'm interested in exploring what we can learn from informal housing practices, spaces, and realities as possible solutions to this global housing crisis. And I should clarify here, although I'm using the concept informality quite broadly and loosely, I'm actually drawing on the idea proposed by Michele Lancione, who talks about a politics of life. And he describes this as a way of being or becoming into the world, sometimes in ways that are deemed incompatible with normative ideas of life under capitalism, or that inhabit places that are conventionally defined as quintessentially uninhabitable. And that these are lives that are lives at the extended margins of our global urban as still possible worlds. And so, yes, I use this to really think about significant ways to think about solutions to the housing crisis. So I do also want to clarify a couple of things. One, I've already said that I am using the term informality quite broadly and generally here to cover a whole set of practices and ways of dwelling and access housing. At the same time, I do not want to fall in the trap of thinking about informality as the opposite of whatever is formal or whatever is market. Scholars like Ananya Roy or even Raquel Rolnick a couple weeks ago, when she introduced this conference, have illustrated the myriad ways in which we are all embedded in current economic systems and structures in multiple and nuanced ways, and that these also include these informal communities. At the same time, I should also acknowledge that many of my colleagues from Latin America and other countries with large populations of informal housing, or colleagues from the so-called global South, have often pushed back against this very idea that we can learn from or find so-called solutions to the housing crisis in these spaces, communities, and practices. So I really don't want to romanticize this at all. I just want to consider this as an opportunity to think, where can we find these solutions, because we are in such a problematic situation, if you will. So with this explanation and caveats, I'm interested in thinking about, can informality provide solutions for the global housing crisis? If so, what can we learn? What kinds of solutions might exist? How do they translate across regions and localities? And how are they sustainable for people as well as the environment? And so briefly, for the last few minutes, I want to reflect on past and present research that I've done in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Buenos Aires, Argentina, and then also more recently in Denver, Colorado, as an exercise in reevaluating how we imagine different places and their broader significance for the global housing crisis. So I'll start with Los Platanitos. This is research that I did when I was still a student. Los Platanitos is an informal community in Santo Domingo Norte, the capital of the northern part of the capital of the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. This community started in the 1970s when rural immigrants arrived to the city and needed a place to live. It was an abandoned garbage dump that rural migrants took over little by little, planting trees and building houses on top of the trash heap. I first visited as a student in 2008, and I was able to return in 2018. Bjorn Sleto, an urban planning professor from the University of Texas, has an ongoing relationship with this community and takes a group of students every 2 years to develop a community-based project. As a result, the government of Santo Domingo has invested more in the community, and so the community has become more integrated into the landscape. Still, in 2008, there was very little information about the community. There were no maps. No one spoke of Los Platanitos, except for the residents from the neighborhood. This community sits downhill on a creek bed that in 2008 would flood every time it rained. The rains would also bring trash from surrounding areas above that would then clog the pipes, exacerbating the water flow. There was no drinking water, electricity was rationed daily, and there was a good share of violence, unemployment, and misery in the area. At the same time, many of the residents had created businesses. There were a couple of markets, a bakery, there was a school, there were 2 churches. Many longtime residents had fruit trees in their small yards that they would use. They would use the fruit, eat it, cook with it. There was a degree of camaraderie, particularly in moments of emergency or collective need. Over time, the community has been able to develop a series of projects to improve the area and to allow for community members to engage in sustainable projects that have improved the conditions of the neighborhood. These include a composting station, a recycling station in which plastic has been recycled as art and other uses. They have also invested in public spaces around the neighborhood, creating meeting spaces and markets where residents can meet to organize or to sell their products. Although residents in the community have been able to achieve some of these things with the support of researchers, they haven't done it alone. As well as government funding, these initiatives have reconstituted the area and the community into one that has become more stable and less precarious, while allowing residents to have access to more stable shelter and community while remaining in the city limits. Similarly, my research in Buenos Aires, which I did for my dissertation many years ago in 2009, but I have also been back multiple times, focused on squatters living in large abandoned buildings in the city center. Buenos Aires is considered similar to a European city, and it is dense with large apartment buildings and multifamily homes and neighborhoods. Due to ongoing political and economic problems, many rundown or half-finished buildings are scattered across the city's landscape and filled with low and middle-income families whose only way to remain inside the city is to live in these informal multifamily buildings as squatters. In these spaces, entire families live in one bedroom, often sharing a kitchen, laundry area, storage spaces, and other common areas on a daily basis, while splitting the cost of utilities and responsibilities. Unlike the informal settlements that are increasingly rampant in the metropolitan areas outside of the city center, squatters in the city center are able to access better quality urban resources like education, transportation, jobs, and benefits that allow them to maintain a better quality of life, despite the internal housing conditions under which they live. For single mothers in particular, this access, and in some cases living in community even with strangers, becomes a way to care for children while they are at work or if there is an emergency. Although these spaces are also highly precarious and residents must contend with violence, community conflict, criminality, as well as the threat of eviction and other forms of instability and illicit activity, many employed these spaces to access better quality resources and benefits. And I did this research in 2009, but having returned multiple times, most of these families that I worked with in 2009 have been evicted from their homes, and yet they've gone to other squatting arrangements, again, to be able to stay in the city, because that allows them, as far as they're concerned, they have a better quality of life in these spaces. And so I want to quickly contrast this with some of my work in Denver, Colorado, which is a little bit different, but again, I'll try to kind of bridge everything together. Which looks at my work in Denver, Colorado, looks at social housing redevelopment, in which longtime residents of a public housing community were displaced from their homes and offered brand new apartments in a mixed income high-rise building in Denver, Colorado. Before I talk about that, I should say Denver is one of the most expensive cities in the United States, with the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment that is approximately 78 meters squared, which costs about $2,000 a month. It also has a large population of homeless people, and tent cities line the city's landscape, even in parking lots and sidewalks, wherever there is space, you can do it. And I put some photos here that really highlight that. Although my research didn't really focus on homelessness, I was looking at a social housing community, which was basically a public housing community that was torn down and redeveloped into mixed income high-rise apartment buildings, in which the public housing residents, many who had lived in this community for more than 50 years, were now losing their homes, their yards, and their community to live in small, individually subsidized rental units, next to mostly young professionals who were paying market rate prices for their apartments. Although these residents were provided new apartments with brand new amenities, which included a washer and dryer, their status was also changed to a privatized voucher system, in which they are no longer under the public housing jurisdiction, but rather a part of the private market. Although residents are now living in improved physical conditions, the loss of community and the increased precarity of the voucher system has left families more isolated and less secure about their ability to keep their homes in the long term. Also, the living conditions, although somewhat stable in the short term, basically meaning that these units are going to be reserved for affordable housing, could in the long term eventually lead to less affordable housing, because these units could be changed over time. And so I just want to highlight, again, these aren't really findings, but some conclusions I have, some things that I would like to discuss further. But I think that in the Latin American context, I think that informality can offer certain things, but we need to be careful in how we talk about this. Families in many ways had more possibilities to find a place to live. At the same time, these were collective spaces in which people were forced to work together. And it created it creates a lot of conflicts, but it also allowed them to rely on one another. In these contexts, private property and land is used and interpreted differently, and informality is tolerated, and the state works within these housing limitations. I think there's other opportunities, there are other things that we can work with here. Whereas I find the US context to be much more limiting. Families are limited in their access to different housing possibilities. They are isolated. They basically are kind of told they have to do this on their own. State resources might be more stable, but they come with different requirements and limitations. Reliance on the state is greater because of control and surveillance. And again, I'm kind of repeating myself now, but access to other housing opportunities outside of the market are severely limited, and disenfranchising residents and leaving them with few options. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Solange Munoz, for the presentation. Now thank you indeed. So let's move now to a discussion. I will try maybe to summarize briefly for those who might have joined a bit late, or just to try to emphasize some of the things that were presented in the two presentations, and then ask a few questions. You already pointed at certain points where you would want to hear each other's feedback, but also later on maybe invite others, other attendees to comment. So starting with the first presentation, again, I will not attempt to summarize the whole presentation, but Leilani emphasized the age of manufactured insecurity, what she called manufactured insecurity, which is characterized by unaffordable housing, homelessness, informality, vulnerability to climate change, and disasters. And she said that based on her experience, this she has seen this in different parts of the world, whether developed or developing, and this is something actually Solange touched upon, right? These phenomena appearing both in the global north and the global south. And Leilani talked about the global financial crisis, and how it instead of leading to certain solutions to some of these issues, it in fact deepened financialization, what she called uber financialization, and it created new forms of financialization with the introduction or the increasing dominance of the new institutional investors, such as private equity actors, pension funds, and so on. Let me see. And of course, she talked about the rights-based, the human rights-based approach to housing, and what does that mean? The three elements she emphasized on: the security of tenure, affordability, and habitability. She proposed the regularization of informal settlements as one way to meet or to approach this human rights-based system. Increased accountability for financial actors, and whole of government approach, the coordinator, increasing coordination between different actors to do so. Solange's presentation, I hope I summarized it well, Leilani. Solange's presentation, well, first she explained how she defines informality. She said that she approaches it from a broad perspective. And let me see. Yes, so she argued that there isn't a lot of, we often highlight the differences between the global south and the global north in terms of housing precarity, but what she argued is there are also a lot of commonalities. There are, of course, differences like in the role of the state, the private property, and development and infrastructure differences. But she highlighted some of these similarities by exploring three cases. One community from the Dominican Republic, another one from Buenos Aires in Argentina, and Denver, Colorado in the States. Yes, she explained the differences in the Latin American context and the US context. So now this leads us to, first of all, Leilani, I would like you to maybe just since we stopped, well, the second one was Solange's presentation, if you can respond to Solange's comment about, what about Canada, and also what about, other parts. That this is what Solange is arguing, the commonalities of these, the situation in different parts of the world. I mean, you did hint at it, but based on your experience, what do you think about these? I mean, what these differences and commonalities that Solange presented?
Yeah, I found your presentation, Solange, fascinating, actually, and I was taking notes and listening well. My sense, I sort of like where you ended in your you called them findings, but not findings, and whatever your final comments, because my experience has been exactly as you described. I've been to informal settlements everywhere in the world, including in North America, up and down California and across Canada, homeless encampments. In fact, I was recently in Denver, not for that reason, but I, of course, saw the unacceptable homelessness in the world's wealthiest country. So obviously, but what's so interesting is my impression has always been that it is harder to live in informality in North America or Canada than it is in some developing countries or global, in quotes, global South countries. Not to say that, and not to, as you suggested, not to romanticize informal settlements in the global South, but there is a way in which governments often, not always, turn a blind eye, or at least turn a blind eye for a period of time. There are, of course, horrible forced evictions in the global South, and I don't want to pretend that there aren't, and lots of displacement, often for luxury developments, shopping malls, apartment complexes, etc. But there is a way in which one can survive in informality in the global South in ways that one cannot in North America. Sweeps in North America are very common. You know, sweeping people off the streets, cleaning streets. I mean, even the language is so disgusting. Although, of course, in the global South, there's language around encroachers and things like that. So, I mean, there are, I guess I am highlighting as well the similarities, the sort of sense that the people living in informality are somehow lesser human beings. They're certainly generally considered to not be valued in terms of their human rights and their human right to housing. That's clear globally. But I do think some of the communities I've seen, and informal communities I've seen in the global South, are amazing. And it would be very hard to replicate that in the North. For example, Nigeria, I went to very intact communities, incredible communities living in informality, vibrant, you know, shopping areas that they created, informal shopping areas, you know, lots of employment for people living in the informal settlement. There is, I will just say about Canada, just to say, there is this notion that Canada is a welfare state. We are not a welfare state. Canada actually is one of the most neoliberal housing markets in the world. We have some of the most expensive housing in the world. And we have a completely financialized housing system. Only 4% of our housing stock is social housing, which is very, very low if you compared it to France or, of course, you know, Vienna, which everyone talks about, but even, you know, Germany, et cetera. We have very, very low rates of social housing, and it's not growing. And we have homeless encampments in pretty much every city across the country, in people living in parks. They are treated brutally. They are evicted. In fact, I'm just now reviewing a letter that we're writing to a city that is about to pass a motion that would make it, and they borrowed this from Florida and other places in the States, it would make it illegal to provide anyone living in homelessness with free water, free food, a tent, a sleeping bag. So that basically prohibiting life-saving interventions by the general public, when the government themselves are not, the city government itself is not providing those life-saving interventions. So I'll stop there. I don't know that I actually answered your question very well, Nanor, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. No, indeed, you did answer very well. Solange, would you like to respond to this? And if not, I mean, of course, we would like to. I would welcome, you know, other participants to give some other examples if they wish. Like I know Mona Fawaz has worked on informality in Beirut. I mean, informality was touched upon in the last discussion as well when it comes to mortgages related to the BUL, Beirut Urban Lab study that Soha presented. And UN Habitat, we have also done a lot of work on collecting data at the neighborhood, at the disadvantaged neighborhood level, on how informality looks like in disadvantaged neighborhoods in Beirut. One thing that is very interesting that we could maybe discuss is the time element. This is something you did mention briefly. You touched upon, Leilani, you mentioned intergenerational security. I think it would be very interesting to discuss that element, the temporal element, and how precarity affects different generations in a similar or different way. And how do these different generations, because it's often intergenerational, how do different generations, how does it change over the generations? And I'm asking this because also of my own background, my own academic research on diaspora studies and also time in refugee studies. This is something that really intrigues me, and I think it's an interesting topic to study, especially to discuss, especially that Leilani, you mentioned, that there was the global financial crisis, but it changed we saw the deepening of financialization. So what's the role of time in all this, in the way that it affects different generations, in the way it affects the system at large? Maybe this is something, if you're interested in commenting, that would be great.
Solange,
is that
do you
for
want
me?
to comment?
Go ahead, Leilani. I think that Nanor's question really does
Yes,
speak
it
to
was
that
both of you.
intergenerational.
Yes.
Yeah, no, but
Yes,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes.
I would be interested, Solange, to know what you've learned through your research about intergenerational, like how the likelihood of living in informality, the children of people living in informality, how likely are they to live in informality? And I think you probably have some sense of that. I can only say that what I'm seeing is just so obvious, a replication of gross inequalities in most societies. So those with can pass on to their children, and those without have nothing to pass on. And the younger generation right now, like if I look at North America or any city, basically globally, it's, as I said at the outset, housing costs are outstripping wages. And so young people, especially if I look at North America, young people are crippled with debt if they go to university. And that's including in Canada, though it's not as bad as in the United States. It's not quite as expensive here, but I mean, people emerge with hundreds of thousands of dollars debt from university. That's being exacerbated. There's an element that's changing now because students are finding it so hard to find anywhere to live. They're foregoing university and then working in low-paying jobs and not getting the education that they might otherwise get. And if their parents don't have something that they can inherit that can be passed on to them, they will just simply continue to live in unaffordable housing, be unable to, climb the ladder, as you say, create savings, etc. So I think what we're seeing is intergenerational poverty, intergenerational wealth. So those who are wealthy, their children will probably do okay, and those who aren't won't. And that in the US, for example, and in Canada, cuts across racial lines for sure, because the poorest people are Black, Brown, Indigenous people in my country, for example, migrants and refugees. And so, and in the United States, African Americans, Hispanic, et cetera. So it also cuts across ability or disability. So persons with disabilities. It also cuts across gender lines, right? LGBTQ, 2S, and women and women who are single parents. So we're just simply, to me, the housing system is replicating inequality.
Thank you. Solange,
would
you like to add anything?
I'll just add really quickly. I think this is more anecdotal at this point, but I do think that, again, thinking about my experience in Argentina, I did meet a lot of people, again, that were able, it was squatters who remained in the city center, living in these terrible conditions, but they were accessing quality resources. And then education was basically free in Argentina. And so I actually saw some families using these conditions to be able to access other things, and their children were quite successful. Now, that is more anecdotal. I completely agree with what Leilani said. We are seeing, the precarity now is across the board. And what's interesting, I think, about the US is that we have this moment in time, and Europe too, we have this moment in time after World War II, where we really saw how housing allowed for this passing on of wealth, this intergenerational, and that's gone. That's completely gone.
Thank you. Thank you. I see many people have raised their hands, so I'll stop asking questions. Dalia, I think you raised your hand first. Maybe introduce yourself and
yes.
Ask your question, please.
Thank you, Nanor. My name is Dalia Wahdain, and I work on the land infrastructure finance nexus in Egypt and the asset class that is currently being created increasingly and rapidly. But during my studies, definitely I found the so-called unsafe areas entangled into this land infrastructure finance nexus. And I definitely agree that part of the solution is to convince the governments to treat shelters as a right, and right to life, and also right to livelihood, even though they might contradict. And that was, to a large extent, the situation in Egypt, even though it was not clearly declared that the governments did see this as a right. But at least until 2008, there was kind of either a benign neglect, let them do what they wish to do. At the same time, the idea that the government doesn't want to shoulder the responsibilities. But then definitely there were lots of policies for stigmatization, but still there was no direct demolitions using the bulldozer. And thinking of part of the solution is the role that organizations like UN Habitat play, because as far as I know, that in 2004, the UN Habitat declared the slum upgrading facility, which was primarily premised on the capacity to make slum upgrading bankable. So they wanted to depend on finance in order to entice private sector or high net worth individuals or other organizations to pitch in financing slum upgrading. And this, in fact, I think might not be a cause and effect, but it was highly associated with the shift in the policy in Egypt, because it gave them the justification to start the demolition under the pretext that this is a kind of a site and services project, which was not the case. And we have the famous case of, I think, Leilani, you must have seen it, the Rawdat al-Sayyida, where the idea was to demolish the entire area and to allow the residents to come back if they can afford the new financial or monetary agreement. But at the same time, at least 25% of the upgrading was through commercial units. And the commercial units were offered in a very cosmetic auction, and people were not able to come back. And eventually the commercial units went to big traders and big names. What I'm trying to say is that part of the solution, which keeps elusive, is the role that the UN Habitat plays, even though it had a good intention, but it gave the justification for governments that are not democratic to use this as a tool for demolitions and evictions that are quite brutal and inhumane. And this was very clear in 2008 when the Egyptian government shifted the entire legal system. by the law 119 of 2008, I think, which actually allowed for a redefinition of the entire built environment, including something called replanning and unplanned. And these two categories allowed them eventually to establish something called the National Map of Unsafe Areas. And the National Map of Unsafe Areas was entirely driven by the UN Habitat. There was, much as I do respect the initial contingency of engineers, but it eventually led to the demolitions and evictions of at least 300 areas across Egypt, under the pretext that we want the slums to be bankable. So what I'm trying to say is, if we are looking for solutions, one of the solutions is actually to get into the relationship between UN Habitat and governments, at least in Egypt. Because I know at first hand that UN Habitat is already situated or located in the Ministry of Housing. And at the same time, it's always trying to navigate. But in most cases, it ends up appeasing the government. So one is the unsafe areas that was driven also by the slum upgrading facility from the UN Habitat, which was, as I said, initially a finance issue. And the other is the land value capture, which is one of the major also programs that UN Habitat is pursuing in Egypt, which is again premised on the possibility of giving lands as bankable assets. And of course, knowing the precarity of the unbuilt or self-built areas and neighborhoods, they are the prime target to securing lands that can be bankable. So I mean, I'm so happy that we can discuss the role of UN Habitat in the solution for the precarity that is increasing under the onslaught of the financial imperative. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dalia, for the question. I wish we had our colleague from the regional office, Salma Yusri. I'm not sure she's here today from UN Habitat, but she's joining us next week, I think, in the roundtable discussion. Personally, I'm not very familiar with the Egypt context, so I will not be able to respond to that. I'm not sure if Leilani would like to say anything, but I would encourage Dalia to maybe ask the same question next week also to Yusra. She might be able to comment from, at least from UN Habitat's perspective, but I'm not sure if the presenters would like to say anything in this regard. And maybe before I give them the chance to respond, I will give the floor to Mona, or I will ask Mona to please take over because I will need to leave to go to my daughter's diploma celebration, and I'm so sorry for leaving you early in this discussion. It was a pleasure chairing this session, and thanks a lot for all of you for joining us. Mona,
thank you, Nanor. Thank you, and congrats
Thank
for
you.
your daughter.
Thank you.
Maybe before I pose the question, I wanted to ask, and guessing that Dina is probably wanting to go on Egypt and perhaps the role of international organization, where I'm sure at least Leilani will have a lot to say. Maybe give you, Dina, the floor to ask a question, and then I'll come back with my questions on informality to the speakers, and maybe others also, if you would like to raise your hand. We still have a little bit of time to discuss. Dina?
Thank you, Mona. My question was actually about a separate issue, so I don't know if you would like me to go on and pose my questions, or should we allow those?
No, maybe go ahead so that we allow the speakers to take on more questions. Go ahead.
So my first question is for Leilani. Well, first of all, thank you to both Leilani and Solange. The presentations were fascinating and so many questions. My first question is for Leilani in regards to you mentioning the risks of expanding mortgage financing into slums, into informal settlements. And I think that, you know, we're sort of witnessing this in different parts across the globe. And I'm interested in kind of unpacking that side by side with the push in making housing finance in general more inclusive of lower income groups and making it more accessible to the poor. And there's a demand for that, because obviously finance tends to be the only way that low income families can become homeowners. So, you know, at face value, of course, having an environment where a low income family is able to access a mortgage and able to even dream about purchasing a home, that would naturally tend to be a positive thing. But at the same time, we cannot ignore, of course, the long-term impacts of being tied up in payments and high interest rates for years and sometimes even decades, especially in times of crisis, such as COVID-19, et cetera. And, you know, we have countless examples. And especially among families that were already living on the brink of poverty. So my question is, and my wonder is, you know, from your perspective, how do you perceive those two trends side by side? And I have a second question for Solange, which is something I picked.
Is it me or is it Dina? It's Dina. Okay, so I guess we lost Dina. Maybe her questions were clear to you, Leilani. Why don't I let you speak, and then if she's back, she can raise her question to Solange. I'm sorry about that.
Sure. I can comment on the earlier discussion with respect to UN Habitat and Egypt, and its role in actually promoting a kind of finance model in the Egypt context of slum upgrading, et cetera. My own experience, for those who don't know, I was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, and I had the occasion to visit on an official visit Egypt. And it was, in fact, the most difficult country visit I undertook as UN Rapporteur. I was the first rapporteur to go there after 8 years, or something like that, 8 to 10 years. And I was not granted free mobility and the ability to, excuse me, fully examine the housing system in Egypt because I was being controlled by the government, not surprisingly. Whilst I was there, I did meet with UN Habitat, and I mean, UN Habitat has had a long struggle with the human right to housing and how it wants to integrate that in its work. And under its new leadership, I think there is more appetite and interest in what the human right to housing might actually mean to UN Habitat's programming. But its programming to date, or certainly up to Maimouna taking the reins, was one that was, I would have to agree, more complicit with a kind of financialized model of housing. And I felt that was the case in Egypt as well. So just to say that what the speaker was talking about is something I did experience, and I think now UN Habitat is having its own reckoning, shall we say, with that sort of thing and asking itself those deep questions. In terms of mortgage financing and in informality, that's, I mean, one of the things I've been conscious of in my own work is to not allow my own analysis to prevent low-income, poor households, et cetera, from getting a piece of the pie, right? I mean, that just seems so unfair. And so I actually, unlike many of my colleagues, I've actually been quite supportive of the idea of trying to figure out how home ownership could work for lower income people living in who are, you know, living on low incomes or no incomes, et cetera. In other words, my sense is that we need to be able to provide opportunities for everyone to have the security that can come with long-term, some kind of long-term ownership. Does it have to be our current mortgage-based system is the question. And the reason I say our current mortgage-based system is when you start really getting into how mortgage-based systems work, I've had to do that recently in Canada, is really look at, you know, how did it come about that we have a mortgage-based housing system and where are we at now with it? I mean, mortgage-backed securities are the name of the game, and that's when you pool mortgages together. And so you've got the mortgages that may end up in default with the mortgages that are really healthy and people are paying back those mortgages. They're all together in and they form securities. And all that does, I was going to say this in my actual comments, but this is a bit technical, but really mortgage-backed securities are simply a way to produce more capital for banks to lend more to investors, to create, it's a financial system unto itself. And I don't think those systems were established to ensure the right to housing for low-income people. And so what we need to try to conceptualize is, okay, what would home ownership look like if it was rights-based? And that's when we start getting into things like community land trusts, for example, where you have the benefits of home ownership, you have the benefit of intergenerational transference, right? So you, under a community land trust, you can, your children can inherit your home, whether it's an apartment or a house. But what can't happen is it can't be put on the private market at private market rates. And so there are ways of selling community land trust units. So if you don't want to pass it on intergenerationally, you can sell it, but you can't sell it for a huge profit and for speculation. And so we have to start thinking in those terms, because I do want low-income people to have security of tenure. Security, I mean, that's the whole point of this conversation today. Security is so important to human well-being, and intergenerational security is super important. The whole idea of human rights is the idea of progress, that we should never be slipping backward, right? We shouldn't have retrogressive rights. We should have progressive rights. And so that should be intergenerationally as well.
Thank you, Leilani. Maybe Solange, as I give you the floor to answer some of these conversations and react on your own, I also wanted to kind of bring in a little bit more those tensions that you brought in your presentation, which really echo a lot of the conversations we have at the lab, that balance between, do we work with informality or do we just really consider that informality is definitely not a guarantee for more justice, and we want a framework of rights, and find ourselves often, whether we're talking about mortgages or just about regulating the housing rental market, very simply trying to think about, in the absence of public agencies that do that, do we just enter the informal market, recognize it as the only thing working and try to put some more justice into it, or is this selling out and we should just keep that high moral stand of asking or demanding that housing is a right, and in that case not playing the game of informality? Just wanted to concur with the fact that in many cases, actually, what we've seen is very similar to Argentina. A lot of the work we've been doing at the lab on the housing of Syrian refugees shows in Beirut that on the one hand, the only access to housing they have in cities is actually illegal, so illegal rent, excessively oppressive, exploitative rent. But that on the other hand, if we demand something better, all we may end up doing is seeing it backfire and then being kicked out of the city. So we are constantly trying to think about how do we empower, and very much like Dalia pointed out, but not in relation to mortgage, we rarely find international organizations to be able to provide that framework of protection. Instead, by accepting that the only way refugees can get housing is through through rent, through an informal market, and actually giving a little bit of financial subsidy to people, what they end up doing is creating that something that looks like the market where people pay rent for something that's not adequate housing because they can get that funding. But ultimately what we're doing is keeping a status quo of inadequate housing, and there is no pressure to change things. So I guess they're just thoughts, but I'm wondering if also in your work, these tensions between, do I work with informality? Do I resist it? Yes, it gives some flexibility, but often within exploitative limited form, how and what kind of options? And maybe just how do we stand as academics vis-a-vis things like this?
Well, I think your question also, I think, bridges a little bit of what Leilani's saying. And it's also really fascinating to listen to Leilani because you have such a wealth of knowledge from your experience, right? Just going to all of these different places and being there and seeing what you've seen. So I really enjoy hearing all of your responses. I'm glad that you brought up, it really is. I think my bigger question in my presentation really is about the tensions. And I remember I wrote this paper a while ago based on my research in Argentina, where the title was "There is no right to the city." And it was during this period of time when everybody was using the right to the city model to really think about what the city was. And I was just thinking, but there is no right to the city. And again, for me, it's also the way I started this presentation. I don't have an answer, but I know that we cannot engage in this work starting off by acknowledging that perhaps there is no real solution right now. And yet, I also really struggle with the conversations that we have and with the work that I do and read about, because we're talking about solutions. And again, using Leilani's argument that we need a rights-based understanding of housing to be able to really capture these things. But we have one, but nobody is using it. We're ignoring it. And that is going to continue. And so I really struggle with this. Well, we should be doing this. And yet we know that these actors are not going to do it. And so I have no answer here. I think, again, my presentation really was about addressing the tensions and the contradictions of the work that we do. But I also acknowledge that I think that in some ways we have to think about it as a problem of scale, because, Leilani's absolutely right. People should have access to a mortgage. If I can help somebody get access to a mortgage, I'm going to help them. And yet a lot of my research is thinking about these bigger structures. And so I think maybe it's really just acknowledging the problem of scale in the research that we do and who it's helping and then the limitations.
Yes, it's always a tension being in that position. I'm not seeing more hands up. We are right at the time of our seminar, so perhaps it's a good time to stop, to really, really, really thank both Solange and Leilani for fantastic presentations this evening and for a great conversation. Also wanted to point out to everyone that Leilani has put in the chat links to both the film Push and the podcast series, and that I strongly recommend that everyone checks them out. And that if you haven't read Solange's paper, There is no right to housing, you should really, really go and read it. It's a great one, among other great works she's done. So we are meeting again next week on Tuesday in the afternoon for 2 roundtable discussions in which we try to bring back this more academic and pointed reflection on mortgages last week, financialization the week before, and the heightened level of uncertainties and informalities this week, and try to connect them to the responses of social protection, which is something that those of us particularly living in the context of the global South, and particularly in countries in crisis, are increasingly seeing as the solution being pushed on us. So we felt the need to bring these two conversations together. There'll be two roundtables that will be managed by colleagues. Very much hope to see many of you there. Thanks again, Solange and Leilani. And as always, thank you everyone who was the organizing team for putting this seminar together, but particularly Saha and Dina for continuing to push this and make it happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much. This was great.
Goodbye.
Bye.